The landscape of American sacred music is built upon voices that carry the weight of entire generations, yet few have borne that burden with the enduring majesty of Shirley Caesar. For over 7 decades, her vocal presence served as a monument of unyielding faith, moral clarity, and an almost superhuman discipline that defined the gospel genre. To the millions of listeners who packed sweltering church pews and cavernous arenas, she was more than a vocalist. She was a spiritual anchor whose lived experiences presumably mirrored the absolute righteousness of her music. However, the golden veneer of public reverence often masks a much darker, highly transactional reality that exists behind the curtain of religious celebrity. In recent years, the narrative of this untouchable matriarch has undergone a seismic and deeply painful shift, revealing a world fractured by profound grief, systemic exploitation, and familial betrayal. The true tragedy of her twilight years lies not in the fickle court of public opinion, but within the silent, closed rooms where her ultimate sacrifices were met with calculated hostility. To understand the profound isolation of her current reality, one must return to the crushing poverty of Durham, North Carolina, where her journey began on October 13, 1938. Born as the 10th of 13 children into a household constantly teetering on the precipice of absolute destitution, young Shirley learned early that survival was a daily negotiation. The family home was a cramped, chaotic space where nourishment was a luxury, garments were perpetually passed down, and the concept of personal privacy was entirely non-existent. Her father, James "Big Jim" Caesar, split his existence between grueling, soul-crushing shifts at a local tobacco processing plant and his weekend passions as a gospel quartet singer. While Big Jim possessed a commanding vocal gift that earned him immense spiritual capital within the local black community, this localized reverence never translated into financial security. The harsh economic realities of the segregated South meant that no matter how hard he labored, his wages could never adequately sustain 13 growing children. Hovering over this chaotic household was the quiet resilience of her mother, Hallie Caesar, who navigated the immense demands of motherhood while battling a partially paralyzed leg and unrelenting chronic physical pain. Hallie became a master of domestic survival, stretching single pots of meager sustenance across entire days while ensuring her children maintained a sense of dignity. Shirley's early consciousness was not shaped by the carefree whimsy of childhood play, but by an acute, omnipresent awareness of financial vulnerability and family responsibility. She watched her mother ration food with mathematical precision, realizing that the margin between survival and starvation was razor-thin. This environment forged an early psychological armor, preparing her for a life of relentless labor, but it also robbed her of the foundational innocence that childhood is supposed to guarantee. The rhythms of the household were dictated by necessity, and every child was expected to be a pillar of support long before their minds could comprehend the weight. The fragile equilibrium of the Caesar household shattered completely when Shirley was merely 7 years old, witnessing an event that would forever alter her psychological trajectory. Without warning, her father suffered a catastrophic fatal brain seizure, collapsing and dying instantly right before the eyes of his traumatized family. In an instant, the remaining vestiges of Shirley's childhood evaporated, replaced by an immediate terrifying vacuum of financial stability and emotional leadership. With no life insurance, no institutional safety net, and a dozen mouths left to feed, the family faced the very real threat of immediate eviction and starvation. Driven by a desperate instinct to preserve her family, the young girl made a monumentally heavy choice that no 7-year-old should ever have to conceptualize. She decided to weaponize her raw, innate vocal talent, stepping into the grueling world of professional performance not for creative fulfillment, but as a literal economic engine. Churches across North Carolina quickly transformed from sanctuaries of communal worship into demanding workplaces where a child's performance dictated whether her siblings ate. At an age when her peers were mastering basic literacy and experiencing the simple joys of elementary school, Shirley was negotiating with pastors and managing crowds. There was no institutional space allocated for her to mourn the sudden loss of her father, nor was there any emotional buffer to shield her from the adult world. Her voice became an industrial tool, a mechanism tasked with keeping the electricity running and ensuring a roof remained over their heads. By the time she reached her 10th year, word of this diminutive prodigy had spread across the state, earning her the moniker of Baby Shirley. She was physically tiny, intensely introverted, and frequently required a crude wooden box just to be visible over the high rims of traditional church pulpits. Yet the moment her lips parted and her voice filled the room, the physical limitations of her childhood seemed to instantly dissolve into something transcendent. Heavy world-weary congregations fell into stunned silence, seasoned church elders wept openly, and charismatic preachers stopped their sermons mid-sentence in absolute awe. There was an inexplicable ancient gravity woven into her vocal delivery, a profound resonance that felt entirely incongruous with her tender chronological age. That unique emotional depth was not a product of artistic training, but the direct result of a child carrying the terrifying responsibility of family survival. Singing was never an aspirational dream or a pursuit of artistic validation. It was a desperate, high-stakes labor mechanism to alleviate her family's crushing poverty. As her mother's physical health deteriorated further, the domestic demands placed upon Shirley's young shoulders grew exponentially more exhausting. By the age of 12, she was thrust into a grueling dual existence, balancing her weekends as a traveling singer with her weekdays as a primary medical caregiver. She assumed full responsibility for her disabled mother, assisting her with basic mobility, managing her hygiene, cooking meals, and maintaining the structural integrity of their home. This intense caregiving role would become her reality for more than 3 decades, persisting long after she achieved global renown and financial independence. Remarkably, even when her income eventually allowed for professional medical assistance, Shirley steadfastly refused to outsource her mother's care to external hands. She harbored a deep, unshakable conviction that personally tending to her mother's suffering was an absolute, non-negotiable spiritual and familial duty. This intimate, daily confrontation with physical pain and vulnerability became the emotional catalyst for her music, giving her a rare authority on stage, but it also sowed deep seeds of isolation. The loneliness deepened significantly when, at the fragile age of 14, Shirley began navigating the perilous terrain of the Jim Crow South entirely unaccompanied. She traversed segregated bus lines, moving through unfamiliar towns where her safety was never guaranteed and hostility was an institutional norm. Because of explicit racial segregation laws, she was routinely barred from entering transit stations, forcing her to spend long, freezing nights sleeping on wooden benches. The economic exploitation she faced during this era was blatant, with unscrupulous pastors paying her a mere 50 cents for an entire week of nightly revivals. These religious leaders pocketed hundreds of dollars generated by her immense drawing power, capitalizing on her youth, her gender, and her economic desperation. She endured these systemic indignities alongside constant hunger and profound isolation, by clinging tightly to an internal narrative that her suffering served a higher divine purpose. Long before the global music industry recognized her as a living legend, Shirley Caesar was already profoundly exhausted, carrying an entire family on her back. Every systemic barrier she encountered and every instance of financial exploitation she survived carved a deeper, more resonant sorrow into her artistic delivery. She was a child soldier in a spiritual and economic war, possessing no institutional protection and no advocate to speak on her behalf. Her formative years were entirely consumed by the relentless demands of others, leaving her with a massive repository of unaddressed grief. This early pattern of total self-abnegation set a dangerous precedent for her future, establishing a life dynamic where her worth was entirely tied to her utility. She became an expert at projecting absolute power on stage while harboring a profound, unaddressed weariness that no applause could ever hope to soothe. As Shirley transitioned into her late teens, the realization settled in that her personal autonomy had been completely surrendered to the collective needs of her family. While other young women her age explored romance, social independence, and personal identity, her life remained bound to domestic care and financial output. Higher education emerged as a beautiful, albeit fragile window of opportunity to grasp a normative, structured existence away from the stage. In 1956, she successfully graduated from Hillside High School and immediately enrolled in college to pursue a degree in business administration. Her core aspiration was remarkably practical. She sought to acquire the institutional literacy required to protect her earnings and stabilize her family's volatile finances. However, this brief pursuit of an ordinary, self-determined future was destined to be permanently derailed by an intense psychological event. During a routine, quiet typing examination in a crowded classroom, Shirley distinctly heard an audible voice speak her name with absolute clarity and authority. Startled by the proximity of the sound, she turned to interrogate the student seated directly next to her, only to find the girl completely absorbed in her work. Hours later, while isolated within the quiet confines of her dormitory room, the mysterious auditory phenomenon returned with even greater force and clarity. The voice explicitly informed her that she had been designated from her mother's womb and uniquely anointed to proclaim the gospel across the earth. For a young woman steeped in the literal interpretations of faith, this experience was not dismissed as stress-induced auditory imagination or psychological fatigue. She interpreted it as an absolute, binding sovereign directive that invalidated any personal plans she had harbored for a conventional life. Driven by an absolute commitment to spiritual obedience over personal security, Shirley dropped out of her college program within days of the experience. Her academic advisors were completely bewildered by her abrupt departure, and her immediate family struggled to comprehend why she would abandon a path toward middle-class stability. Yet she possessed an internal certainty that rendered external validation entirely irrelevant, believing that hesitation in the face of divine instruction was a form of moral failure. 2 years later, at the age of 19, she demonstrated a brilliant display of audacity that would forever alter the trajectory of gospel music. She walked directly up to Albertina Walker, the formidable leader of the Caravans, which was then the most prestigious and musically sophisticated gospel ensemble in America. Shirley did not meekly audition or wait for an industry scout to discover her talents in the rural South. She confidently introduced herself to Walker, boldly asserting that she possessed the vocal versatility to master every single vocal part within the group's complex arrangements. To prove her claim, she delivered a performance that left the seasoned gospel icon with no choice but to immediately induct her into the group. Upon entering the Caravans, Shirley's artistic presence acted as a revolutionary force that disrupted the traditional, highly restrained boundaries of the genre. She refused to remain static behind a microphone, choosing instead to run down aisles, leap across stages, weep openly, and engage audiences with an intense physical delivery. While certain conservative music purists found her highly kinetic, unpredictable performance style deeply inappropriate for sacred spaces, audiences were utterly electrified by her raw passion. The Caravans embarked on a relentless, unforgiving touring schedule that saw them performing more than 300 calendar days a year across the segregated American landscape. However, the immense artistic triumphs they experienced on stage never translated into basic physical comfort or financial equity off the stage. The harsh realities of American apartheid meant that these iconic black women were routinely denied entry to hotels, forcing them to sleep upright on cramped buses. They were frequently turned away from restaurants, forced to subsist on cold rations while traveling thousands of miles to perform for integrated or white audiences. Shirley watched this profound systemic inequality unfold up close, noting that white gospel ensembles performing identical circuits commanded significantly higher performance fees. Furthermore, she quickly realized that the gospel industry was deeply patriarchal, with male performers automatically granted structural authority, administrative respect, and superior financial compensation. Black female vocalists, regardless of their superior drawing power or artistic genius, were culturally expected to remain quietly grateful for mere public exposure. Behind the deafening ovations of these massive crowds, Shirley was still routinely skipping meals, suffering from profound physical exhaustion and sending her meager earnings home. Her dual reality remained intact. She was an international gospel star on the weekend, and a tired caregiver sending money back to Durham on Monday. By the arrival of the mid-1960s, the initial euphoria of national exposure began to give way to a justifiable, deep-seated professional frustration. Shirley began to advocate for creative autonomy, equitable financial compensation, and a basic level of professional respect that mirrored her immense contribution to the group's success. When she courageously raised these structural concerns to the industry powers of the era, the institutional response was cold, swift, and entirely unyielding. The established male-dominated hierarchy made it abundantly clear that the exploitative operational structures of the industry would not alter for her comfort. Recognizing that her continued participation in the group required the total submission of her worth, Shirley made a monumentally risky career decision in 1966. She walked away from the security of the Caravans, choosing professional exile over continued systemic exploitation. The gospel music establishment reacted to her departure with harsh condemnation, with powerful industry executives confidently predicting her immediate professional demise without a group structure. Major music publications speculated that her highly specialized, intense performance style could never sustain a solo career over an extended period. Even revered church elders and mentors warned her that independent solo artistry was not a safe or appropriate space for a young black woman. But Shirley chose to trust the exact same survival instincts that had guided her through the dark streets of Durham during her childhood. She boldly signed a solo recording contract that, for a black female gospel artist of that specific historical era, featured unprecedented financial and creative terms. Her debut solo studio album was unleashed shortly thereafter, delivering a sonic and thematic shockwave that sounded entirely unlike anything else in the marketplace. The compositions were stark, unvarnished, and socio-politically sharp, addressing issues of poverty, systemic racism, internal doubt, and systemic endurance. The music critics of the era were deeply polarized, with traditionalists claiming the thematic material was far too secularized and intensely personal. Others argued that her blunt structural critiques of societal failures stripped the music of its traditional, escapist religious value. Shirley completely refused to engage with her critics or offer public defenses of her artistic choices, believing that raw truth possessed its own inherent validation. The record-buying public responded to her vulnerability with overwhelming loyalty, causing her demographic reach to expand dramatically across the nation. Yet despite her undeniable commercial power, the systemic resistance and institutional roadblocks within the music industry refused to dissipate. Event promoters consistently offered her male contemporaries significantly higher appearance fees for fewer performance minutes on identical concert bills. Studio producers continuously attempted to manipulate her public image, trying to mold her into a more passive, aesthetically compliant package. Even when major mainstream award institutions finally recognized her artistic excellence, the accolades arrived decades late, following years of being deliberately bypassed. Shirley chose not to engage in public protests or media campaigns against these corrupt systems. She simply absorbed the institutional injustice and kept moving. By the dawn of the early 1970s, Shirley Caesar had accomplished something extraordinarily rare. Evolving into a gospel icon who penetrated mainstream cultural consciousness. She achieved this without compromising her theological messaging or diluting the visceral intensity of her vocal delivery. However, this mainstream crossover success generated a fierce, defensive backlash from conservative religious traditionalists who accused her of blurring sacred boundaries. Shirley countered these theological critiques with a simple, devastatingly effective philosophy. She was still singing exclusively for her creator, regardless of the venue. What external observers consistently failed to perceive was the devastating physical and psychological toll this relentless warfare was extracting from her. The exact same woman who had carried her destitute family through childhood was now expected to carry the entire economic survival of an industry on her back. Part 2. The arrival of institutional influence and international acclaim did not grant Shirley Caesar a shield against the deep psychological vulnerabilities generated by her early life. While her finances stabilized, the haunting memories of childhood destitution remained a driving force behind her everyday choices. In 1969, while sitting before an abundant, luxurious Thanksgiving feast in her comfortable home, a televised news broadcast permanently altered her internal focus. The report detailed the devastating realities of systemic starvation among impoverished children living just a few miles from her own front door. The stark, disturbing contrast between her private luxury and the public misery of those vulnerable families triggered an intense moral crisis within her. She realized that using her voice merely to generate artistic applause or personal wealth was a profound abdication of her moral responsibility. This realization catalyzed the formation of her expansive outreach ministry, an initiative that would see her channel vast percentages of her performance income directly into community aid. Initially, she made a binding personal pledge to allocate 50% of her gross concert earnings directly to funding food banks and clothing drives. Over the years, as the socioeconomic crises plaguing urban centers worsened, her financial commitment to these charitable programs expanded exponentially. She steadfastly refused to seek or accept government grants, harboring a fierce belief that a ministry funded by her personal labor carried a pure moral authority. Her financial advisors and close friends frequently warned her that her radical philanthropy was placing her long-term financial security in extreme jeopardy. There were fiscal years where she was forced to take out substantial personal loans against her future tour earnings just to keep her soup kitchens operational. As her expansive charitable infrastructure grew, the structural pressures mounting against her musical career became increasingly complex and difficult to navigate. In the late 1970s, she deliberately stepped into another massive storm of industry controversy by boldly integrating elements of funk, soul, and contemporary rhythm and blues into her gospel albums. The resulting studio recordings reached urban demographics that traditional gospel music had historically failed to engage, driving her sales to unprecedented heights. While younger generations embraced her innovative, modern musical arrangements, conservative church hierarchies openly accused her of compromising with secular culture. Shirley refused to engage in these theological debates, maintaining that reaching broken people in modern spaces mattered infinitely more than institutional approval. In 1983, at the age of 44, she finally allowed herself to claim a piece of personal happiness separate from her career. She entered into holy matrimony with Bishop Harold Ivory Williams, a deeply revered pastor, theologian, and accomplished musician within the Black church community. For the first time in her exhausting life, her daily existence felt genuinely collaborative rather than an isolated burden she had to carry alone. Together, they assumed the spiritual leadership of a massive, vibrant congregation in Raleigh, North Carolina, meticulously balancing pastoral care with her touring schedule. Many industry insiders falsely assumed that the stability of marriage would naturally quiet her intense drive and signal the twilight of her career. Instead, she entered a period of heightened productivity, balancing her pastoral duties with demanding recording schedules and international travel. That very same year, however, an unexpected tragedy nearly erased her life and career in a single violent moment. While traversing a treacherous, frozen highway during a grueling winter concert tour, her promotional bus hit a patch of black ice and flipped violently. Shirley sustained severe, life-threatening internal and physical injuries, and her heart temporarily ceased beating before emergency medical personnel could arrive on the scene. She would later recount that during those brief clinical minutes of death, she experienced a profound spiritual transition into an extraordinary realm of absolute peace. This near-death experience left an indelible mark on her psyche, serving as the raw emotional blueprint for one of her most legendary songs. When she was revived, she did not retreat into a period of extended rest. She channeled that trauma directly back into her performances. Through the remainder of the 1980s, she consistently chose to stand on the front lines of major social crises that other prominent religious figures deliberately avoided. When the terrifying specter of the AIDS epidemic gripped the nation and triggered widespread panic, many conservative churches closed their doors to suffering patients. Shirley responded by opening the doors of her Raleigh congregation wide, offering physical care, financial assistance, and spiritual dignity to those facing terminal diagnoses. This progressive stance triggered immediate, severe backlash from more conservative elements within her own congregation and the broader church community. She faced explicit anonymous threats, and a significant number of long-term wealthy church members formally withdrew their memberships and financial tithes in protest. Shirley remained entirely unmoved by these financial penalties and social pressures, asserting that true love never required organizational permission or cultural consensus. Her moral clarity during this dark era cemented her status as a true leader, but it also reinforced her isolation within the industry. This absolute devotion to duty ensured that when personal tragedy inevitably struck again, the emotional impact would be completely devastating to her psychological well-being. On July 4, 2014, while the rest of the nation celebrated with fireworks, Shirley Caesar's private world collapsed into an absolute agonizing silence. Her beloved husband of 31 years, Bishop Harold Ivory Williams, peacefully passed away at the advanced age of 93. For Shirley, this loss represented something infinitely deeper than the traditional mourning of a spouse. It was the destruction of her ultimate emotional sanctuary. He had been her intellectual equal, her co-pastor, and the only human being with whom she could fully drop her public armor. After an entire lifetime of standing as an unyielding pillar of strength for millions of others, she was suddenly cast back into isolation. The public funeral was a massive, highly publicized affair that drew thousands of dignitaries, celebrities, and grieving fans from across the global music community. On the stage, under the glare of television cameras, Shirley maintained an impeccable stoic composure that the public immediately praised as an inspiring display of faith. Privately, however, those who occupied her immediate inner circle witnessed a woman who was completely crushed by the sheer weight of her grief. She returned to an empty Raleigh residence, forced to navigate the profound silence of a home that had once been filled with partnership. Yet before she could even begin the fragile process of mourning her monumental loss, a deeply painful conflict began to materialize from within her household. Within months of the bishop's passing, an aggressive, highly toxic dispute erupted over the legal distribution of his estate and assets. Bishop Williams, adult children from a previous marriage, individuals whom Shirley had helped raise and financially supported for decades, launched aggressive legal challenges. They sought total control over a vast array of assets, including the personal residential property and financial holdings tied directly to the church infrastructure. What began as a series of quiet, tense disagreements behind closed doors rapidly hardened into an adversarial, highly publicized courtroom confrontation. Scurrilous accusations began to circulate through the church community, with malicious whispers questioning her financial integrity and her personal motivations regarding the estate. The woman who had spent half a century systematically giving away millions of dollars of her own wealth was suddenly painted as a greedy stepmother. For Shirley, this specific betrayal inflicted a wound that cut infinitely deeper than any racial or corporate exploitation she had survived. She had successfully fought against corrupt record executives, racist promoters, and patriarchal church systems, but she was entirely unprepared for a knife from her own children. Throughout the agonizing legal proceedings, she chose to maintain a strict, dignified silence in the media, refusing to engage in public mudslinging. Close friends later revealed that this public silence was not an indication of inner strength, but rather the paralysis of absolute heartbreak. At the exact same time, deep-seated historical wounds involving her own biological siblings began to aggressively reopen under the stress of the situation. Decades earlier, following the death of her mother Hallie, intense disputes over family legacy had left deep, unhealed scars among the Caesar siblings. Now, in the wake of her husband's death, history was repeating itself with terrifying precision, as love was replaced by cold legal distance. As Shirley attempted to piece her fractured life back together, a new, highly insidious threat emerged from the digital landscape. In 2018, an algorithmic wave of malicious, entirely unfounded rumors began to proliferate across major social media platforms. The viral headlines boldly accused Shirley Caesar of systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the tithes and offerings of her own congregation. In the modern digital economy, sensationalized headlines travel at lightning speed, entirely outrunning complex, boring factual corrections. Online commentators and digital gossip channels quickly filled the factual void with malicious assumptions, creating a highly toxic narrative around her name. To an outside public increasingly cynical of religious leadership, the story seemed like a classic case of pastoral corruption and financial greed. The underlying reality of the situation was completely undramatic, yet the reputational damage inflicted by the viral lie was almost impossible to reverse. A rigorous independent financial audit conducted by a certified accounting firm conclusively demonstrated that every single cent of church funding was accounted for. The formal investigation proved that the vast majority of the church's financial capital went directly into funding community food programs and outreach initiatives. In fact, the audit revealed that during several fiscal quarters, Shirley had quietly injected hundreds of thousands of her own dollars into the church. She was entirely exonerated of any financial wrongdoing, but by the time the legal truth surfaced, the digital mob had already moved on. The initial salacious accusations remained permanently indexed in search engines, while the formal vindication received a fraction of the public attention. Then, the digital landscape began to generate even more bizarre, highly distressing fabrications regarding her physical health and mortality. False news reports began to circulate with alarming frequency, confidently asserting that the legendary singer was currently suffering from terminal throat cancer. Other automated content websites went so far as to publish formal obituaries, falsely announcing to the world that Shirley Caesar had died. Complete strangers, driven by these digital lies, began arriving at her private residence to leave funeral arrangements on her lawn. The aging icon was forced to sit in front of cameras to record awkward videos just to prove to the world that she was alive. While she attempted to maintain a humorous public posture regarding the death hoaxes, close associates noted that the emotional exhaustion was taking a physical toll. Part 3. The digital onslaught did not abate with the clarification of her mortality, as the years 2024 and 2025 brought an influx of increasingly sophisticated attacks. Highly deceptive, fabricated legal documents began to circulate across online forums, including a completely forged last will and testament. These fraudulent documents maliciously claimed that her lifelong estate had been entirely depleted, leaving her virtually destitute in her advanced age. Concurrently, an unknown individual emerged from the anonymity of the internet, launching a highly publicized claim that he was her secret illegitimate son. This individual aggressively demanded court-ordered DNA examinations and a substantial legal stake in her financial and musical legacy. Though the claims were entirely fraudulent and possessed no legal merit, the digital ecosystem ensured the story remained in circulation for months. Pastor Shirley Caesar has spent her entire earthly existence lifting the collective spirit of humanity through the vehicles of music, faith, and radical sacrifice. Yet during the vulnerable twilight of her life, when she required a protective shield of communal gratitude, she was met with cold isolation. Her extraordinary life trajectory forces an uncomfortable, deeply challenging truth into the open light of critical human analysis. Absolute devotion to a divine calling does not grant an individual a magical immunity from the visceral sting of human cruelty. Walking a path of moral righteousness and self-sacrifice offers no structural guarantee of a peaceful, harmonious ending within this earthly existence. As she enters the final chapters of her historic journey, the massive spiritual legacy she constructed remains undeniably powerful across the globe. However, the staggering personal and emotional price she was forced to pay behind closed doors remains an impossible reality to ignore. The systems of commercial entertainment and institutional religion proved to be deeply extractive, taking everything she possessed while offering zero protection when the wolves arrived. She gave her childhood to preserve her family, her youth to establish an industry, and her wealth to sustain the poor, only to face betrayal. The modern digital culture turned her profound grief into cheap entertainment, prioritizing clicks over the preservation of an elder's dignity. Her story serves as a stark reminder that society frequently worships the art while systematically destroying the fragile human artist who created it. When we look back at the immense trajectory of her 7 decades on the global stage, we see a woman who gave until there was nothing left. The historical narrative of Black women in American music is perpetually defined by this exact archetype of uncompensated emotional labor and systemic exploitation. They are expected to be the modern sin-bearers of culture, transforming their private agony into public ecstasy for the consumption of the masses. Shirley Caesar stepped onto a wooden box at 10 years old to feed her family, and in many ways, she never got to step down. The demands of her audience, her family, and her faith formed a beautiful but deeply suffocating cage that remained locked until the very end. The legal warfare initiated by her stepchildren remains one of the most glaring indictments of how quickly greed can erase decades of maternal love. To weaponize the assets of a deceased father against the woman who stabilized his life and ministry is a profound moral failure. It highlights the unique vulnerability of aging icons who find themselves surrounded by individuals more invested in their legacy than their humanity. Shirley's choice to remain silent during that family war was not a sign of submission, but a final act of supreme dignity. She refused to allow the sacred memory of her marriage to be dragged through the mud of public consumption, even if it meant absorbing the blows alone. Furthermore, the institutional failure of the church community to collectively rise up and shield her from these digital attacks reveals a profound modern superficiality. The very institutions that were built upon the financial and cultural capital she generated over 50 years remained largely silent during her trials. When the viral embezzlement lies threatened to destroy her moral authority, the institutional defense was sluggish and entirely inadequate. It was her private resources that funded the audits and her private strength that sustained the counter-narrative against the digital machine. This reality demonstrates that in the modern religious marketplace, individual leaders are often viewed as disposable commodities rather than treasured institutional elders. The modern internet operates as an unfeeling coliseum where the achievements of a lifetime can be completely dismantled by an anonymous algorithm. The fact that a living legend had to repeatedly record videos to prove her own physical survival is a deeply tragic commentary on our era. It shows a complete lack of historical reverence and basic human empathy within the contemporary media ecosystem. Shirley Caesar became a target for content creators who viewed her name not as a monument of sacred history, but as a keyword to optimize traffic. This constant digital violation creates a unique form of psychological stress that is particularly cruel to inflict upon an elder who spent her life practicing discipline. The emergence of fraudulent heirs demanding DNA testing represents the absolute nadir of modern celebrity exploitation. It is a calculated attempt to extract financial capital from a lifetime of labor by capitalizing on the vulnerabilities of an aging widow. These legal and social fabrications require significant emotional energy to combat, draining the vital internal resources she should be using to rest. Yet, through each successive wave of these modern indignities, her core spiritual framework appears to have remained entirely unbroken. She continues to project a sense of cosmic optimism that feels entirely foreign to the cynical, hyperconnected world she now inhabits. This resilience, however, should never be used by the public as an excuse to minimize the profound injustice of her treatment. We frequently romanticize the strength of Black women to avoid dealing with our collective responsibility for their systemic exhaustion. Shirley Caesar did not possess a magical superpower that rendered her immune to the agony of betrayal or the weariness of constant warfare. She was a human being composed of flesh, blood, and deep emotion who felt every single blow delivered by her family and the public. To ignore her pain while celebrating her endurance is a profound form of historical and cultural blindness. The lessons embedded within the later years of her journey offer a vital critique of how our culture treats its aging pioneers. We must move beyond the superficial practice of presenting lifetime achievement awards while allowing the human beings behind them to be exploited. True cultural reverence requires the construction of protective community networks that shield our legends from financial and digital predation. Shirley Caesar's life should serve as an urgent catalyst for a broader cultural conversation about the preservation of elder dignity. Until we learn to protect those who spent their lives protecting us, our celebrations of their legacies remain entirely hollow. The financial sacrifice that defined her outreach ministry stands as a direct challenge to the prosperity-driven narratives of modern religious consumerism. She demonstrated that true spiritual authority is earned through consistent proximity to human suffering, not the accumulation of personal luxury. By routinely emptying her personal accounts to ensure the marginalized were fed, she modeled a radical ethics that modern society struggles to comprehend. This profound financial selflessness makes the subsequent accusations of greed and embezzlement uniquely insulting to her character. The world projected its own deep-seated cynicism onto a woman whose entire financial history was a testament to radical generosity. As we look toward the future, the vocal recordings she left behind will undoubtedly continue to inspire and instruct future generations of vocalists. The technical brilliance of her phrasing, the raw emotional power of her delivery, and her innovative genre blending changed the course of music history. But the true measure of her narrative lies within her silent endurance of the immense personal cost that accompanied that genius. She stood at the center of a cultural storm for 70 years, maintaining her moral equilibrium while the world around her devolved into chaos. Her life remains a profound testament to the power of an unyielding human spirit facing an extractive world. The deep loneliness that Shirley carried since her childhood in Durham never truly left her. It simply transformed into the emotional fuel that fed her art. The haunting quality that drew millions to her music was the direct result of a soul that understood what it meant to be abandoned. In her twilight years, that loneliness returned in its most unvarnished form, stripped of the youthful energy that once helped her run away from it on stage. Yet there is an undeniable majesty in how she occupies that quiet space, refusing to let the world see her as a victim. She remains the master of her own narrative, a towering figure who refuses to bend to the smallness of modern digital gossip. Ultimately, the story of Shirley Caesar is not a tragedy, but an epic saga of a woman who outlasted her oppressors and outlived her critics. The systemic barriers of Jim Crow, the patriarchal structures of the music industry, and the digital lies of the modern era could not silence her. Her voice remains an permanent part of the American cultural tapestry, a sound that will echo long after the viral headlines have faded into oblivion. The personal costs she endured were undeniably immense, but the spiritual fortress she constructed remains entirely impregnable to the forces of decay. We are left with the image of a woman who began her journey singing on a wooden box and ended it as an immortal queen of American song. The modern audience must decide whether they will continue to be passive consumers of these stories or active participants in protecting living legends. When we allow false narratives to proliferate without aggressive contradiction, we become complicit in the erosion of our historical foundations. Protecting the legacy of Shirley Caesar is an act of cultural preservation that requires our collective commitment to truth over entertainment. We owe her a debt of gratitude that can only be repaid by honoring her humanity as deeply as we honor her music. Her journey challenges us to build a world where devotion is met with peace, and a lifetime of right choices guarantees a quiet sanctuary at the end. As the curtain slowly closes on this extraordinary era of gospel history, the silence left behind will be immense and deeply felt. There will never be another baby Shirley standing on a wooden box, carrying the salvation of her family in her throat. There will never be another pioneer who can bridge the gap between the traditional plantation spirituals and the hypermodern rhythms of the 21st century. She stands as a unique bridge between two entirely different worlds, a historical anomaly whose like we will never witness again. Her endurance is our instruction, her sacrifice is our convicting challenge, and her voice is our eternal treasure. The final evaluation of her life will not be determined by the balance of her bank accounts or the stability of her family's structures. It will be found in the millions of broken hearts that found healing through the medium of her recorded testimonies. It will be found in the hungry children who were fed by her secret financial losses, and the outcasts who found shelter in her church. These are the eternal monuments that no legal dispute can dismantle and no digital lie can tarnish. Shirley Caesar lived every single word she sang, and the scars she carries are the ultimate proof of her absolute authenticity. The ultimate triumph of her twilight years is that despite the accumulation of grief and betrayal, she has not allowed her heart to become cynical. She still speaks of love, still practices radical faith, and still offers her life as a blank canvas for her creator. This lack of bitterness in the face of intense pain is the true definition of spiritual majesty. It proves that the armor she forged in the poverty of Durham was strong enough to withstand the sophisticated warfare of the modern world. She remains entirely untouchable, not because she was spared from suffering, but because she chose to transform her suffering into an eternal song. We are left with a deep sense of awe as we contemplate the sheer scale of the journey this single human being has traveled. From the tobacco factories of North Carolina to the highest echelons of global cultural recognition, she walked with absolute purpose. The fractures that faith alone could not mend were ultimately absorbed into her larger narrative of endurance, becoming part of her complex beauty. Her story forces us to look in the mirror and ask hard questions about how we value our elders, our artists, and our faith leaders. Shirley Caesar has run her race with impeccable honor, leaving the rest of us to figure out how to live up to the standard she set. The music continues to play, the old records continue to spin, and across the world, someone is listening to her voice to find the strength to survive another day. This is her true reality, an ongoing, living ministry that completely bypasses the small, temporary distractions of legal battles and internet hoaxes. She belongs to the ages now, a historical force that has transcended the limitations of her era and the betrayals of her immediate environment. The personal cost was heavy, but the return on her investment is an immortal legacy that will continue to redeem humanity for generations to come. If you found this analytical documentary script insightful and deeply resonant, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel for more unvarnished, deep-dive historical narratives. We want to hear your thoughts on this complex legacy, So please leave a comment down below sharing your perspective on how we can better protect our living legends. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these critical stories to light with the depth and respect they truly deserve.